On the right, there is a growing faction which seeks to root their identity and philosophy in the pre-Christian literature, traditions, and values of Europe. As it becomes increasingly clear that Christianity is ineffectual in stopping the forces which are destroying the West, and may even have been, in part, their cause, this desire to return to an older, more solid foundation, one closer to home, makes sense. But among those who seek out an ancient identity and ancient solutions to modern problems, we find an ideological divide. We find two factions. The first are those who consider themselves traditionalist pagans. They seek to understand the worldview of their ancestors and are focused on faith, identity, and tradition. The YouTuber Survive the Jive is a primary example of this type. The other faction are those who are essentially Nietzscheans, even though they may call themselves sometimes pagans. Their philosophy is rooted in Nietzsche and strongly anti-traditional, but they often pull on pagan aesthetics or project their views into Homer, and generally consider themselves to be an extension of the pagan European spiritual project. I began in this second faction, but increasingly I find myself moving towards the first. My own thinking is extremely influenced by Nietzsche, but I think there are several holes in his philosophy, and I'm going to talk about those in this video. In many ways, Nietzsche was the first pagan philosopher, the first in the school of Western philosophy to sidestep Plato and philosophize in the tradition of Homer, in the tradition of the Dionysian mysteries. And for this, anyone interested in the pagan project must be eternally grateful to him. Nietzsche laid the philosophical foundation for the revival of paganism in modernity. Yet, while he was inspired by the pagans, he himself did not seek out a revival of European paganism. In some ways, his worldview is ancient and traditional, but in other ways it is quite modern and very transgressive. It could not exist without the highly biological, evolutionary, and racial views of his particular time. He wasn't seeking out a reconstruction of what the ancient Greeks or the ancient Germanic tribes believed, but rather inspired by them, he was seeking to forge a new philosophy. Although Nietzsche rejected Darwin's interpretation of evolution, Nietzsche's philosophy could not have existed without the herald of evolution, of Darwinism. Similarly, even though models for the steppe invasions of Europe, the Indo-European conquest of Europe, were impartial at his time, his philosophy depends on them and their implications, both in India and in Europe. So before I critique Nietzsche, we need to figure out, what does Nietzsche actually believe? Nietzsche argues along these lines. Life is a struggle between higher and lower types. It is the right and imperative of the higher biological types to triumph and rule over the lower. And Nietzsche and those following in his tradition pick out the pagan type of man, beautiful, strong, daring, vital, the pagan hero, the pagan demigod, as the higher type because he is quote-unquote more healthy. In other words, he has a stronger will to power, which really just means he has a stronger life force. He has more vitality, which is expressed in his beauty and his boldness of spirit. Therefore, he represents healthy life because health manifests as beauty and strength, and sickness manifests as ugliness and weakness. And of course, I'm generalizing a little bit here just to paint the picture. So how does Nietzsche arrive at these beliefs? Well, his fundamental presupposition starts with taking the side of life, which is fundamentally something which is anti-entropic, something which grows. Plants literally struggle against the spirit of gravity as they grow upwards towards the sky. So Nietzsche takes the side of the most healthy specimens because they represent the most anti-entropic, the most vital, the most alive forms of life. The tallest trees, the most vital and strong-willed men, great heroes. He embraces the will to power, the will to growth, the will to life, the will to conquest, which is the primary instinct which drives all biological life, from men to lions to ants to plants. Throughout his writing, Nietzsche emphasizes the idea of being light and of flying, of soaring. He associates the Übermensch with these qualities. And he talks about killing the spirit of gravity he says that when he met his devil, he found him serious and heavy, weighty. Now, Nietzsche's idea of life as the will to power, as consumption and growth, comes directly out of Homer, whether he realized it or he came to this subconsciously. So Nietzsche brilliantly puts the foundation of the European pagan worldview into philosophical terms, and it would appear that he did so largely intuitively. And this is actually pretty astounding. I've talked about this at length elsewhere in my recent video about the symbolism in the Iliad and the Odyssey, but I will briefly summarize it again here. In Homer, we see that living organisms, and therefore man, is comprised of two primary instincts: growth, which manifests in man as a striving for excellence and glory, and consumption, which manifests in man as his lower instincts, his appetites. The default state of the natural world, the world beyond custom and law, is a state of all devouring, where everything is trying to eat everything else as each organism strives to conquer and excel. Again, this is the world which Odysseus experiences at sea when the Cyclops Polyphemus dismisses Zeus's laws and devours Odysseus's men, devours his guests. This is the law of nature, the law of all against all. Therefore, Homer and Nietzsche are both correctly identifying what's going on in nature. It's a war of all against all, life, striving, consuming, conquering, devouring. Again, I've talked about this in great detail in other videos, but I think you get the basic idea here. In addition to the idea of the will to power, Nietzsche takes up the traditional pagan idea that the chain of being is what gives life meaning, and he states this explicitly in his discussion of the Dionysian mysteries in Twilight of the Idols. I'm going to read that passage here. For it is only in the Dionysian mysteries, in the psychology of the Dionysian state, that the fundamental fact of the Hellenic instinct, its will to life, is expressed. What did the Hellene secure for himself with these mysteries? Eternal life, the eternal recurrence of life, the future promised and hallowed in the past, the triumphant yes to life despite death and change, real life conceived as the collective prolongation of life through procreation, through the mysteries of sexuality. To the Greeks, the symbol of sex was the most venerated of symbols, the really deep significance of all the piety of antiquity. All the details of the act of procreation, pregnancy, and birth gave rise to the loftiest and most solemn feeling. In the doctrine of the mysteries, pain was pronounced holy. The pains of childbirth sanctify pain in general. All becoming and all growth, everything that guarantees the future, involves pain. Here, Nietzsche is talking about how the Dionysian mysteries celebrated the eternal life gained through reproduction, not personal immortality, which can be gained only through heroic action and the resultant fame and glory which a hero gains for himself, but collective intergenerational immortality. Again, as Nietzsche puts it, real life conceived as the collective prolongation of life through procreation. This is exactly what the Homeric hymn to Demeter, the myth of Persephone being kidnapped by Hades, is explicitly about: the cycles of death and rebirth and the general immortality of life. Life as a collective which is reborn each spring, which is reborn each generation. And the Eleusinian mysteries in honor of Demeter and Persephone were tied closely to the Dionysian mysteries. And Nietzsche also says that, quote, all becoming and all growth, everything that guarantees the future, involves pain, end quote. And we might also add, requires not just pain, but consumption. The fundamental, horrific fact of life, the fact made holy in the animal sacrifices of our ancestors, is that man must kill, must devour flesh in order to live, in order to grow. This is the fundamental nature of all biological organisms, and here we return again to the foundation of Homer's thought and of Nietzsche's thought. At the root of all life is consumption and growth. In Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche states this very idea even more explicitly. Quote, life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation. But why should one forever use precisely these words, on which for ages a disparaging purpose has been stamped? Even the organization within which, as was previously supposed, the individuals treat each other as equal, as we see in every healthy aristocracy, must itself, if it be a living and not a dying organization, do all that towards other bodies which the individuals within it refrain from doing to each other. It will have to be the incarnated will to power. It will endeavor to grow, to gain ground, attract to itself and acquire ascendancy, not owing to any morality or immorality, but because it lives, and because life is precisely will to power." End quote. So what Nietzsche's saying here is that even in societies or organizations, when the members of that society or that organization, that aristocracy or democracy, even if they treat each other equally, that organization, that collective, must behave according to the laws of life, according to the laws of biological organisms. So the members of an aristocracy may be equal to each other, and yet they seek to grow as a collective. They rule over the lower classes of their society, and we know that even in democracies or in organizations where the different members are supposedly equal to each other, there is still competition no matter what. And so here Nietzsche is completing the Homeric formula. The basic instinct of life is the will to power. That is, as he describes it, the will towards growth, expansion, ascendancy. But this growth necessitates, as he puts it, exploitation and incorporation. In other words, the consumption of other life forms. This is true on the very level of the cell. Man must eat in order to get the nutrients which he needs to grow. And it's also true on the level of the organization, as Nietzsche argues above. This is the iron law of all that is alive. And this is where Nietzsche's idea of the Übermensch comes in. Like the pagan hero, the Übermensch possesses a greater will to power, and therefore a stronger being, a stronger life force, a stronger essence than his fellow men. And here Nietzsche also pulls in the idea of the ancestral chain again, and of evolution. From ape to man and man to superman, we have a duty to pass on a biological and spiritual inheritance to the next generation, and to continue striving for higher types, for heroes, for supermen who surpass the common men. These supermen and the aristocracies which birth them, therefore, become the very justification of life itself, its aim, its goal, and it is therefore our imperative to do all in our power to protect, encourage, and create the conditions for the birth of these higher types. So in regards to all the points we've discussed so far, we don't really have that much departure from the European pagan worldview, mostly just elaboration, reinterpretation, modernization, bringing evolution into the mix. But for the most part, he's just restating the European pagan worldview with these basic points about consumption, about growth, about life as the will to power. But Nietzsche takes it a step further. Inspired by the Indo-European conquest of Europe and the caste system which the Indo-Europeans set up in India, Nietzsche advocates for a harsh, exploitative relationship between the higher and the lower, and goes so far as to say that morality itself was created by the lower to restrain the higher. I think you can see how he arrives at this idea from what we've discussed so far. To quote again from the above passage, quote, "Life itself is essentially appropriation, injury, conquest of the strange and weak, suppression, severity, obtrusion of peculiar forms, incorporation, and at the least, putting it mildest, exploitation." End quote. If exploitation is a necessary precondition of life, if growth requires consumption, then Nietzsche must affirm this exploitation in order to fully affirm life and life's fundamental nature. And he does this. Nietzsche is essentially arguing for a full embrace of life and the nature of life, both the destructive, devouring aspect and the creative, growing aspect, since one cannot be separated from the other. Again, we need to eat in order to grow. In Nietzsche's belief, then, the proper ordering of things is the subjugation and exploitation of the lower by the higher, the lower classes by the aristocracy, both in service of life and out of the necessity of survival for those higher types, since they are so greatly outnumbered. And many Nietzscheans project this might makes right philosophy into Homer, into the beliefs of the ancient European pagans. The problem is that the traditional European pagan view, the one seen in Homer and elsewhere, again in the Norse sagas and Irish literature all across Europe, refutes this stance quite explicitly. The Iliad ends with Achilles giving in to custom and law and returning the dead Hector to his father, just as law and peace are restored at the end of the Odyssey with the help of Athena's divine intervention. You'll often see people today invoking the Choreos Mannerbund ethos as the ultimate expression of European pagan society. Yet in the texts of our ancestors, we can see clearly that this was meant only to be an initiatory stage, which was followed by a return to order, law, and ancestral continuity. In the founding myth of Rome, Romulus and Remus are expelled into the wilderness, where they are suckled by a wolf. After they gain their strength as young men, they return to avenge their father, who was deposed by his brother. They restore proper ancestral continuity. By putting the king, the source of order on earth, back on his throne, they also restore the Sky Father and his laws to their proper place in the heavens, the throne of the world. You see the exact same thing in the Norse saga of the Volsungs. Again, I've brought this up many times before. Volsung is betrayed and killed, and his son Sigmund and his grandson Sinfjotli hide out in the woods, and there they find magical wolfskins which transform them into wolves, and they go around murdering and robbing people in lupine form. However, once Sinfjotli has gained his youthful strength, they burn the wolfskins and avenge the murder of Volsung, again restoring both justice and the proper chain of ancestry. So just like the consumptive aspect of nature is necessary for growth, this violent initiatory stage is also necessary, but it is necessary as a precondition to bringing about order. Achilles' violent rage and Odysseus' time at sea can be taken as representations of the same basic idea, a time spent without law or custom in the wilderness, which is followed by a return to law, order, and the restoration of the ancestral chain. Achilles returns Hector's, albeit dead, body to his father, and in the end of the Odyssey, Odysseus retakes his kingdom from the lawless suitors and reunites with his son and father, securing the royal succession. Together they put on their armor 3 generations side by side, and we see in that moment the true immortality, real life, for which Odysseus rejected Calypso's offer of personal immortality. Odysseus could have become immortal. He could have essentially become a god if he had accepted Calypso's offer. But to him, that personal immortality meant death, because it would mean the death of his fame, of his story, of his memory, and of his son, of his lineage, of his kingship. For Odysseus, true immortality lies in these things, in fame, in memory, in lineage, not in the preservation of his body. So what am I getting at? Nietzsche starts with the same fundamental ideas about nature as Homer, the same ideas about the nature of life, and even expands upon these wonderfully, puts them, really for the first time in history, into philosophical rather than narrative language. But the pagan view, which the Iliad, the Odyssey, and many other pagan texts are devoted to demonstrating, contradicts the conclusion of Nietzsche's philosophy. Our pagan ancestors believed that the consumptive aspect of life must be submitted to the growing aspect, otherwise it leads to destruction. This is seen in the myth of Zeus overthrowing Kronos, who was devouring his own children, and Theseus overthrowing the Minotaur, who was devouring the Athenian youth. When the exploitative and consumptive aspect of life, which is fundamental to life, rules, when it dominates, life devours itself, and then all growth, all excellence is stunted, is made impossible. You see this same archetype, either the devouring king or the devouring of the king, again in the Iliad and Odyssey. Achilles calls Agamemnon a king who devours his people because he is violating the kingly obligation of generosity. He's supposed to feed his people, but instead he's taking from them. And in the Odyssey, the suitors are literally devouring the wealth of Odysseus' household and plotting to kill his son. So while we see in the worldview of our ancestors that consumption is essential to life, they believed that the consumptive aspect of life must be submitted to, subordinate to, the growing aspect. To put it simply, you should not be ruled by your appetites, by hunger, lust, and greed, but rather by your drive towards greatness, towards striving, upwards going, towards the Sky Father, the light of glory, all that is the growth instinct manifest in man. The devouring element of human nature should not be cut off or uprooted or rejected, as is the priestly ideal, the ascetic ideal, but it should be subservient to this striving element. It should feed into it, because that is its function. We eat in order to grow. If things are inverted, and the devouring aspect is primary, is on top, then life devours itself, and greatness is thwarted. And I think you can see that this clearly isn't some kind of arbitrary moralism meant to restrain the stronger. In Odysseus' case, this morality protects him from the suitors. Yes, in the case of Kronos, it is the weaker who are being devoured, but in the case of Odysseus, it is the stronger, the king, the royalty, who is being devoured by the suitors. And this moral outlook about the proper ordering of life actually follows logically from Nietzsche's own assertions. In Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche writes, quote, "Species do not evolve towards perfection. The weak always prevail over the strong, simply because they are the majority, and because they are also more crafty." And I think this really is the key point. The lesser forms of life are better at devouring than the higher types, while the higher types of life are better at the mastery of their environment. In the long run, smaller, less complex life forms, in a certain sense those things which are quote-unquote less alive, like insects and viruses, actually perform better. This is why Nietzsche said that Darwin was wrong for placing the survival instinct as the primary instinct of life rather than the will to growth, the will to power. Man may be able to gain mastery of the entire planet, but he has no defense against being devoured by a virus, a fungus, or a cancer. The gargantuan lizards which once walked the earth remain for us only as fossils, while rodents and birds are still with us today. It is thought that the dinosaurs went extinct after the fallout of a meteor impact blacked out the sun, causing the food chain to collapse and large life forms to starve to death. Larger life forms require more food to support their energy output, and they produce far less quickly, giving them an inherent disadvantage against smaller, less complex life forms in long-term survival outcomes. Nietzsche argues that this is also true in civilization. The lesser men both outnumber and outlive the higher, more vital types and castes. This is precisely why Nietzsche argues for a harsh, oppressive, exploitative relationship between the higher and the lower, and an embrace of the devouring aspect of life. But again, here's the problem. If you make the devouring aspect of life equal on the hierarchy of value to its striving aspect, then the higher types will always be devoured by the lower. Because again, the lower forms, the lower types, in nature and in society are better at devouring. They may be worse at mastery. Again, man may have mastery of the planet, but he is easily devoured by a virus. If one's goal is to protect the higher types, then the devouring element of life, the devouring instinct in man must be subjugated. Kronos must be overthrown. This is the meaning of the solar hero who continually descends into and beats back the forces of darkness, entropy, and death, which threaten to overwhelm and devour life every generation. The function of pagan morality was not to restrain the strong. Rather, it was the necessary precondition for ensuring the health, survival, and flourishing of higher types. In a highly exploitative society where the aristocracy has nothing to do, decadence is bred. The aristocracy becomes removed from nature and human nature, removed from any natural pressures, all the pains which growth necessitates. That's what's happening to us today. And this means that the aristocracy in an exploitative society begins to degenerate, basically because their life is too easy. and this makes it easier for them in turn to be overthrown, to be devoured and consumed by the lower castes. This was the case with the Romans, whose empire collapsed less than 100 years after they converted to the religion of a people which they had conquered. History clearly demonstrates that slave and serf societies destroy themselves. Either the aristocracy is overwhelmed by numbers in Rome, for example, or in ancient India, or the aristocracy becomes decadent and the undercaste revolt, like in France or in Russia. By creating this highly exploitative system, ironically, in the long run, you essentially ensure the destruction of the higher types and the aristocracy. This is not an argument for radical egalitarianism by any means, but it is clear that Rome would have been better off had they not overstretched their empire so that Italy was only a fraction of it and imported a slave population that came to outnumber their own. That's clearly just not a good idea. And the traditional European pagan worldview already accounted for all of this. Its laws, customs, morality, and theology all sought to correctly order human nature to encourage the higher impulses, and to correctly order society to encourage and protect the higher types. But this necessarily means submitting the devouring aspect of nature, which Nietzsche affirms, and protecting the lower against the higher, so that the lower castes, like roots, feed into the higher castes, who protect them like branches. And this can only work in a smaller, more homogeneous, non-imperial society. And it should be the same in the individual. The lower appetites must feed growth and upward striving towards the daylight Father, towards the light of glory, towards the radiance of excellence, so that each individual reaches towards the sky and the light of the sun like the branch of a great ancestral tree.
To support this channel and gain access to hours of extra content and the ARC's private community, check out the link in the description. Thank you for your support.